Have you ever wondered what a forgotten war sounds like when it's retold, not with glory, but with grief and soft rain? You're probably hearing this late at night, maybe under a blanket, maybe alone with your thoughts. So let's take this gently. Subscribe to our channel and let me know where you're listening from. Karachi leads, a quiet room where no one knows you're still awake. Tonight's story takes us far south, where icy winds blew across a pair of rocky islands small on the map, but immense in memory. The Falklands War of 1982 was just 10 weeks long, yet in that brief span, thousands of lives were changed forever. We'll follow voices from both sides, British and Argentine, who never meant to be heroes, but were asked to carry out unthinkable things. We'll move from invasion to surrender, from dusty barracks to burning ships, through mud, fire, confusion, and long silences after the gunfire ended. No politics, here just people who remembered the taste of blood, the sound of static radios, and the weight of flags being raised or lowered. A quiet war retold calmly, like a bedtime story no one dares to forget. The sea was already changing color when the message arrived. The governor's voice, broadcast with a mixture of formality and fear, floated through the radios, and Stanley, like a cough in a church, hesitant, cracking, trying to speak calmly while everything around him was unraveling. Argentine forces had landed. First came the frogmen, silent and cold, slipping from submarines under cover of night. Then came the troops, filmed proudly by their own navy, stepping ashore as if reclaiming something sacred. The invasion of the Falklands or the Malvinas, depending on which flag you carried in your heart, had begun. For Argentina, it was a patriotic surge decades in the making. Schoolchildren had grown up tracing the outline of the islands on chalkboards, learning the year 1833 like a hymn, when Britain first took them. For the military junta, drowning in economic collapse and blood-soaked repression at home, the islands were a lifeline, an old grievance, reborn as national salvation. And so when the soldiers marched across the tundra grass, they were cheered not only by orders, but by the weight of generations. In Buenos Aires, thousands gathered in the Plaza de Mayo, the same square where mothers of the disappeared once wept, now filled with flags and flares and slogans. Even critics of the dictatorship found themselves clapping, smiling, crying. For Britain, it came as a shock. An old colonial outpost, suddenly the center of global attention. Parliament erupted in fury, ministers resigned, and across the grey, rain-washed streets of England, a silent dread settled. But in the first hours of war, it wasn't yet bombs or blood that shaped the story. It was that strange and electric stillness, as two nations turned toward a handful of islands in the cold South Atlantic and decided that pride was worth more than peace. And while politicians drew lines on maps, ordinary soldiers packed their kits, tried not to show their hands shaking, and wondered, quietly, how many of them would ever see home again. The task force would soon set sail, but far below, on damp soil not yet dry from the morning dew, the first footprints of war had already been laid. And if you stood still on the rocky coast that night, you might have heard not a battle cry but something much quieter, a question carried on the wind, asking if the islands themselves had ever wanted to be fought over at all. The islands did not answer. Of course, they never do, but the ships did. As their hulls groaned into motion and their shadows stretched long across the docks at Portsmouth, Devonport, and Rosyth, it wasn't just warships and submarines that left. It was supply vessels, hospital ships, cargo freighters hastily painted grey, fishing trawlers conscripted into logistics, and passenger liners stripped of their upholstery and filled with paratroopers. Engineers, Marines boys mostly, some still carrying acne and awkward smiles. The men aboard these vessels wrote letters that trembled in ink. Some played cards to forget where they were headed. Others stared at the sea, listening to the hum of engines below deck, pretending they didn't hear the whispered talk of missiles and death. There was strange laughter aboard Toother, sort of brittle cheer that follows shock. Soldiers joked about darts leagues forming on the way to war, about dancing in Stanley once it was over, about earning a medal without firing a shot. Few believed it would last long. Fewer still thought it would end gently. On one ship, a man wrote to his wife, telling her where to find his favorite song, where to scatter his ashes if needed, and how to explain to their child what kind of man he had tried to be. Another tucked a photo of his girlfriend behind his dog tags and never took it out again. And yet, among all the private dread, there was an eerie compart, disbelief, part ritual, part machinery. The task force moved like a slow, muscular arm reaching south, and even the ones who didn't want to fight began to believe that perhaps they had no choice. In Argentina, the euphoria was louder, flags waved, horns blared, and in the plazas, even the poor cheered for the war they thought would be quick and clean. They hadn't yet heard of the submarine shadowing their beloved cruiser, or the torpedoes that would carve loss into their navy forever. Nor had the British yet tasted what it felt like to watch a missile scream across the water toward a ship that had no way to defend itself. All of that would come soon enough. But for now, the war was still sailing, buoyed by pride, confusion, and the silent weight of what none of them knew they were walking toward. But before any shots were fired at sea, there were voices, fractured, trembling, sometimes translated, mid-sentence breaking, across static-choked frequencies. A British radio operator in Stanley whispered updates while lying flat on the floor, gun pressed against his back, the cold metal making every word catch in his throat. "If you take the gun away," he muttered, "I'll read the message properly." The station had been taken. The invaders had arrived not just with weapons, but with tape recorders, speeches, and uniforms that still smelled of home. Some islanders peeked through curtains, seeing only smoke, hearing the sharp cracks of rifles, and wondering if they were next. In those early hours, fear was not yet militariate, was personal, domestic, felt in the knees and stomach and fingertips. A woman played music loudly through open windows as her husband was held at gunpoint in their garden, hoping the national anthem might at least give him a kind of dignity if he died there in his shirt sleeves. Even the soldiers didn't always seem sure who the enemy was. One Argentine conscript found a rusty English nail stamped "Made in England" and stared at it for minutes, dumbfounded, wondering how to reconcile the geography of patriotism with the texture of someone else's home. Meanwhile, back in Buenos Aires, the crowds kept celebrating, arms raised, chanting songs as if it were a football victory rather than an occupation. But there were doubts even then. Among the officers, among the conscripts, and even among those cheering in the plazas, the same unspoken question pulsed. What if Britain actually came back? What if this wasn't the end, but only the beginning? What if the war they'd summoned with speeches and flags turned out to be real and far crueler than any of them were prepared to face? And somewhere in a darkened corridor on a ship slicing southward, a British Marine sat alone and thought of the French and the Dutch in 1940, and wondered if they, too, had once believed their enemy would never cross the sea. The air was beginning to thicken. The war had not yet taken its first breath, but already its voice was cracking on the radio. And while the radios sputtered and choked on static, the waters were already listening, dark, cold, and ancient, bearing witness to the silent hunter beneath them. The submarine HMS Conqueror had been tracking its prey for days, gliding like a shadow beneath the icy Atlantic. Its target was the General Belgrano, a proud symbol of Argentina's naval tradition, a World War II-era cruiser reborn with national meaning. On board were hundreds of sailors, many young, many dreaming of a short war and triumphant return. They played cards, polished brass, scribbled letters home, unaware that death was threading its way toward them in absolute silence. And then, from the depths, came the order from London, a political decision that would echo for decades. 3 torpedoes fired, 2 struck. In an instant, everything changed. The first explosion split the ship's side, filling lower decks with flame and freezing sea. Men screamed as lights failed. Water rushed in. The second torpedo sheared off the bow. Chaos reigned. In the dark, they searched for life jackets, for friends, for any sign of escape. Those who made it to the surface climbed onto life rafts, eyes red from salt and smoke, limbs burned or trembling. One young officer curled on top of a raft, hands folded peacefully beneath his face. From a distance, he looked like he was sleeping, but he had already frozen to death. They drifted for 2 days. Some slipped into the ocean and were never seen again. Others sang songs through cracked lips to keep from crying. And those who survived would never again be able to smell salt air without remembering the fire below. In Britain, news of the sinking brought a brief, savage euphoria. An enemy ship destroyed. Cheers in the mess halls. But it didn't last, because across the water, Argentina's retaliation had already begun. Fighter jets, armed with French-made Exocet missiles, screamed into the sky, low and fast, skimming the waves like predators. One of those missiles found its mark at HMS Sheffield, a ship without adequate defenses. The missile punched through her side. Fire spread, smoke poured into her corridors. Men crawled through blackness, bleeding and blinded, searching for escape. Hatches the sea burned red that day, and the war no longer belonged to politicians. It belonged to the sailors who couldn't breathe, the pilots who couldn't miss, and the families who would soon receive letters that did not contain words but silence, dressed in folded flags. And while the folded flags sat quietly on kitchen tables, thousands of miles away, on the island itself, sandbags were waiting piled hastily outside homes, framing doorways, stacked at machine gun nests where the air smelled of oil, wet canvas, and anxious sweat. Port Stanley had become a strange mix of fortress and village. Razor wire looped around gardens, helicopters thudding in the distance, and islanders walking past soldiers with lowered eyes. The Argentine troops had grown into a force of nearly 10,000, many of them conscripts, barely trained, boys from warm cities suddenly dropped into freezing wind and foreign mud. Some believed in the mission with fiery patriotism. Others clutched their rifles like strangers and whispered to themselves at night. They had been told the islanders were waiting to be liberated, but instead they found cold stares, polite refusals, and English words that carried no gratitude. One soldier recalled picking up a biscuit tin that read "Product of the United Kingdom." and realizing that everything, every cup, every bolt, every signpost belonged to someone else. Meanwhile, the locals were issued ID cards, told to obey curfews, and forbidden from leaving Stanley. They remembered stories of occupied Europe, how quiet terror moves in small, daily humiliations. But beneath that surface unease, there was still an eerie kind of restraint. No rapes, no massacres, a few thefts, a few threats. The war here was not yet a fire, it was a fog. Even so, stories filtered through. A man kneeling in his garden with a gun to his spine. A woman playing loud patriotic songs to drown out her panic. A child told to stop smiling because it might be mistaken for rebellion. And while the Argentinians reinforced bunkers and wrote letters with numb fingers, British commanders debated landing points. They studied maps. They guessed strategies. They remembered Normandy and how a beachhead without movement turns into a trap. So the British chose a quieter place, San Carlos, a lonely inlet guarded by cliffs and ghosts. There the landing would begin. Not with glory, not with drums, but with paratroopers stumbling out of boats, boots sinking into wet sand, not yet shot at, not yet wounded, but already changed. Because once a foot touches hostile ground, no soldier ever walks the same again. And those boots, mud-caked, waterlogged, and trembling, were still sinking into the beach at San Carlos. As the mist rolled back to reveal a sight most of the young paratroopers would never forget. Grey frigates anchored like sentinels in the bay, helicopters buzzing in loops above them, and long strings of landing craft pushing slowly through the water. Each packed with soldiers who had rehearsed this in training fields, but never under fire. The landing was strangely unopposed. No gunfire, no resistance. Only wind and fog and the pressure of moving fast before that silence shattered. The men poured ashore with too much adrenaline and not enough clarity. Screaming, stumbling, some even laughing from the absurdity of it. This was war, they told themselves, but it felt like a drill gone sideways. Companies scrambled to find their bearings, slipping on the rocky soil, reassigning roles in the confusion. Had the enemy fled, or were they watching, waiting to strike? The answer came hours later, not from the cliffs, but from the sky. Argentine fighter jets screamed through the clouds and dropped death like darts. Ships burned, explosions echoed across the inlet. One soldier on the ground looked up and saw a bomb falling and said nothing, just watched. There was a strange pause before impact, a breath held by the world, and then metal screamed. Fire leaped, and the sea turned black with smoke. On board, one hit ship. A sailor's fingers blistered as he tried to crawl toward a light. Others shouted, names that were lost in the roar. There were men who ran, and men who froze, and men who didn't move at all. But even after the fires died down, no one looked at the water the same again. The landing had succeeded, but the cost had arrived early. And amid the chaos, commanders received pressure from London to keep pushing, to prove progress, to show resolve. They radioed for orders, received silence, and made decisions anyway. One major muttered that he would win the war first, then resign from the army. Another sat down and quietly wrote his will on the back of a ration wrapper. The war had now found a rhythm: land, strike, burn, bury, and advance. But not all battles would happen in wide fields. Some would take place in places too small for map trenches, ridge lines, and tiny villages where men would either break through or be broken inside. And in those places too small for maps, the trenches began to breathe, shallow cuts in the earth that held men like uneasy secrets, their spines pressed against cold turf, fingers frozen around rifle stocks, breath visible in the chill. At Goose Green, the terrain was rough and forgettable. Scrub, peat, wire, and silence. But beneath that silence was the heartbeat of something old and terrible: close combat. The kind that strips away tactics and uniforms until all that's left is fear and muscle. The British attack came before dawn, under cover of darkness and white phosphorus that lit the sky like ghost flares. They advanced in bursts low, fast, shouting names and orders no one could hear. Gunfire raked the grass. Tracers danced in the mist. Somewhere in the confusion, a young lieutenant clutched his radio and heard the phrase every soldier dreads: "Sunray is down." Their commander, H. Jones, had been killed while charging a trench. Shot in the back, he fell onto the position he was trying to take. Soldiers watched in stunned disbelief as the man who had led them was swallowed by the very earth he'd demanded. "They conquer," another man whispered. He wasn't supposed to die, and no one answered. The fighting dragged on for hours, ugly and uneven bayonets, grenades, panicked retreats, brutal pushes forward. Somewhere in the blood and fog, victory was declared. Goose Green was taken. But the price had a smell: wet soil, metal, blood, and burning cloth. The dead lay twisted in ways that didn't make sense, arms bent backward, faces frozen mid-sentence. A corporal found a wallet in a fallen Argentine's pocket and opened it to find a photograph smiling children beside a lake. He put it back. Silently, that night, the survivors sat on ammo boxes and ration tins, passing around tea that tasted like smoke and dirt. No one spoke about the man who had died leading them, but no one forgot either. Somewhere in a pocket, his watch was still ticking. And from the top of the ridge they had taken, the men looked eastward, with Stanley still distant, still defended, and now closer than ever. The next battles would be harder, the air would be thinner, and the soldiers who had just killed, for the first time, would soon learn how much harder it was to survive with that memory inside them. And that memory of the first time you kill, of the moment your bullet finds not a target but a face, was now moving with them, packed into rucksacks, clinging to uniforms, whispered in dreams they wouldn't speak of. As British troops pushed closer to Stanley, they carried not only weapons and gear, but an invisible weight of things they couldn't unsee. Bodies burned or bloated, friends torn open by shrapnel, the sound of someone calling for their mother in the dark, the syllables rising above the gunfire like a child's cry in a thunderstorm. And for every yard of frozen ground they took, the cost grew. The weather turned worse: freezing rains, snow falling sideways, boots soaked to the bone. Fresh water was rare. Men dug into the peat to find puddles, filled mugs with black sludge, and dropped sterilizing tablets in like hope. Diarrhea swept through the ranks. Underwear was discarded mid-march. A medic told them to keep drinking, but the more they drank, the more the earth took its toll. The Yomp, they called it, the long march to Stanley. 60 miles through mud, ice, hunger, and silence. No vehicles, just legs and willpower. Some cursed under their breath, others sang to keep rhythm. Most just kept walking, too tired to do anything else. And all the while, the Argentine conscripts waited, cold, undersupplied, dug into mountains with fear nesting behind their eyes. They counted shells. They prayed. They passed cigarettes between trembling fingers. They were 19, mostly. Boys, not killers. Many had never seen combat. Some had never seen snow. Now they were being told to hold off one of the world's most experienced militaries with worn rifles and frostbitten hands. A few wept quietly at night. Others carved names into their helmets, as if writing themselves into history might stop them from being erased. Across the ridge, British commanders planned the next assault. Artillery was positioned, timetables, whispered, and someone said too loudly that it would all be over soon. But wars don't end just because you want them to. And as night fell, both sides prepared for what was coming, as if sleep itself might be the last comfort they'd ever know. And that sleep, when it came at all, was fragile, snatched in damp foxholes, interrupted by distant shellfire, or broken entirely by dreams that ended in screaming. In the mountains surrounding Stanley, the silence before dawn stretched so long, it became almost unbearable, a taut string humming with everything unsaid. British troops lay in wait, teeth chattering, fingers numb, listening to their own hearts pound beneath layers of wool and wet camouflage. Orders had been given. At first light, the assault would begin. No one spoke of fear anymore. It had passed that phase. Now there was only tension, like waiting for a storm to arrive while already soaked to the skin. When the signal finally came, it was not a trumpet or a flare, but the ground itself erupting. The ridgeline lit up tracer rounds, slicing the dark, explosions turning rock to dust, and men stumbling forward into chaos. One soldier recalled it as being on the wrong end of a machine gun range, bullets above, below, beside, too fast to count, too close to breathe. Someone nearby took a grenade to the chest. Another yelled he'd been hit, handed his rifle to a mate, and started walking away, dazed and burning, phosphorus clinging to his skin. Still, they pushed on. The ground was unforgiving steep, wet, and mined with terror. Somewhere in the firefight, an Argentine boy screamed for his mother, and both sides froze for just a moment, caught in the same helpless horror. Then, another burst of gunfire broke the trance. The British advanced in waves, their numbers thin but unyielding. Argentines fired from bunkers, fled from trenches, or dropped their weapons in surrender. But not all died from bullets. Some were mistaken for corpses and loaded onto the piles, only to blink hours later and terrify the living. One young Argentine was shot in the head. He felt the bullet skid along his helmet, tear down his neck, and leave him alive. Crawling through blood and mud, he looked out from the ridge and saw Stanley in the distance, quiet and waiting. It was almost over. But in the last flashes of battle, the war didn't loosen, its grip had tightened. The wounded screamed, the dying prayed, and for those still standing, the question returned, louder than ever. What was any of this truly for? And that question, what was this truly for, echoed through the shattered hills, louder than any artillery that had come before it. It followed the stretcher-bearers as they climbed toward the wounded, only to be torn apart by sudden shell blasts that left limbs scattered like broken tools. It lingered in the hands of a soldier who touched his leg and found the muscle gone, 2 fingers slipping into a wound as deep as disbelief. And it sat silently beside those who survived only because others did not. By the time the British reached the final slopes, their breath was ragged, their packs lighter, their eyes hollowed by what they'd seen. But still they moved forward past craters, past frozen corpses, past the surreal calm of men who no longer screamed because they had no more sound left in them. And finally, as the smoke lifted, Stanley came into view, quiet, battered, and flickering with uncertain light. The Union Jack was raised once more, not to cheers, but to the sound of boots stopping and weapons lowering. Some British soldiers wept. Others stared blankly, too numb to feel pride. "We heard about the surrender from the BBC," one recalled. 8,000 miles away even, though it happened just down the road. It wasn't a celebration, it was a release. For many, the true joy came not in victory, but in the knowledge that no more of them would die tomorrow. But elsewhere, the price was still being paid. Argentine soldiers, dazed and gaunt, looked on in silence as British forces moved in. One conscript spoke softly in English to his captors, confessing he didn't know why they had fought either. Some wept as they were disarmed. Others sat blank-eyed, hugging themselves against the cold. The dead lay everywhere, faces twisted. In agony, wallets scattered in the dirt beside family photos and crumpled letters. A British soldier, trying to keep his sanity, spoke aloud as he searched bodies for ID tags, not to his comrades, but to the corpses. "All right, mate, I'm just taking these," he whispered. "Won't be long." But the longness was already there, in the silence that followed the gunfire, in the eyes of the living and the stares of the dead. The echoes of every unanswered question lingered and would continue to, for years to come. And as those echoes continued, some of them took the shape of flags lowering, not in ceremony, but in quiet defeat. For the Argentinians, the surrender came not as a sharp moment, but as a slow unraveling. Artillery guns had run dry. Air support was gone. Their radios whispered static. Their trenches were filled with cold, exhausted men who had not eaten properly in days and no longer believed in promises. Some had discarded their boots to tend to infected feet. Others still held rifles they hadn't fired, too frozen to lift. In Stanley, the officers met under flickering lights and signed the surrender. They tried to keep their posture straight, but their faces had already collapsed. One conscript remembered watching the Union Jack rise again and feeling something like betrayal, not just by his commanders, but by the world that had let them believe they could win. "I was so angry," he said. "I broke down crying. Had done everything. I had starved, fought, watched my friends die. And after all that, their flag flew above mine." The British soldiers didn't gloat. They stood still, watching the ceremony with heavy breath and heavier limbs. There was no victory march, no trumpet, just the hush of weapons being laid down, and boots turning to walk away from what they had survived. Back home, the news broke like sunlight through curtains. There were cheers in pubs. Front pages screamed words like triumph and glory. But for those who had lived it, the glory was hard to find. One British Marine stared at the town of Stanley and whispered, "Is this what we came for?" Dirty streets, the smell of death, broken furniture, and red crosses painted on every other door. And still, they stayed there for days, requisitioned. Houses, shared floorboards, nights spent staring at ceilings, trying not to hear the echoes. They turned on radios, hoping for good news, but what they got instead were reminders of what had been lost. And in Buenos Aires, soldiers returned to clubs, to streets, to parties that looked like nothing had happened. "I walked into a bar," one said, "and everyone was smiling, laughing, drinking, like it had been a football match. I felt like a ghost standing among the living." Some of them didn't go home right away. Some couldn't, not because of duty, but because the real world had already moved on and they hadn't. And those ghost men who had marched in uniform but returned invisible began to follow them everywhere. For many soldiers on both sides, the war did not end with surrender. It merely changed shape. It entered their dreams, their silences, the spaces between footsteps on familiar streets. British veterans came home to parades and bunting, but some flinched at the sound of drums, saw red when ketchup spilled, or woke up gasping in rooms that smelled of clean sheets instead of gunpowder. They smiled for cameras, accepted medals, but avoided fireworks. One refused to visit the beach ever again. Another taped over the word Malvinas in every newspaper he saw, as if muting the name could quiet the memories. Argentine conscripts returned to a country that had shifted while they were gone. The junta that sent them to fight was crumbling. Mothers of the dead wore black armbands in protest. Some towns ignored the returning soldiers altogether, ashamed of the defeat. One boy said, "When I got off the bus, no one was there. Not even my father. Just a dog tied to a tree." The army gave them discharge papers, a cold handshake, and nothing else. No therapy, no pension, no words for what they had seen or lost. Some drank. Others disappeared into the provinces, changed names, or simply stopped speaking. And yet, in their silence, the war lived on. The hills of Darwin and tumbled down, the freezing sands of San Carlos, the smoke-blackened waters where ships had burned all of it stayed. For some, it whispered only in the quiet moments, when the world was still and memory was loud. For others, it screamed daily. One British soldier drove trucks for years and never turned on the radio, afraid the static might bring it all back. And in Argentina, a veteran worked in a bakery, never telling anyone that his scars weren't from an oven. Burn. At reunions, they spoke in soft tones, pausing often, glancing at the floor. They didn't cry, they didn't smile. They just nodded slowly, like men who had walked through something the rest of the world could never quite imagine. And still, even as the world turned its gaze to new wars, new headlines, the ghosts stayed close, watching quietly, never needing to be remembered, because they had never truly left. And while those ghosts lingered, what remained most haunting were the names that were missing, mispronounced, or never spoken aloud again. In the official rolls, they were recorded with rank and number, coldly typed and filed away. But in kitchens, in schoolrooms, and in half-empty pubs, they lived differently. "That was my brother," someone would say, pointing to a photograph on a mantel where the smile hadn't aged. In Argentina, mothers gathered in silent rows each week, holding black and white portraits of boys who had vanished beneath sea or soil. They stitched banners with their sons' names, not because it would bring them back, but because the world seemed to forget them faster than it should. Some of those names were never officially listed. Bodies lost at sea, soldiers burned beyond recognition. Unknown combatant, the grave markers said, but someone, somewhere, remembered. A pair of boots by the door, a letter never finished, a song one soldier used to hum while cleaning his rifle. In Britain, the ministry released a memorial booklet with a list of the fallen, but in homes across the country, families folded the pages slowly, searching for names they already knew by heart. One mother kept dialing her son's old number, just to hear it ring. Another received his belongings in a sealed plastic bag and couldn't bring herself to open it. The bag sat in her closet for 10 years, Even among the survivors, names were shifting. A man called Smitty in the field returned home as David again, and the change felt like shedding armor. But for others, the old names stuck ghost names, carried like medals or scars. They whispered them in sleep. They carved them into benches, helmets, wrists. And when asked what the war had taken, they didn't always say a friend or a leg or a year. They often said nothing, because the missing names weren't just of people, they were of selves. The person they had been before the landing, before the shot, before the fire. That version of them had no grave, no rank, no medal. Just a place where their story changed, and where silence took over. And those silences, the ones that followed the names left unsaid, grew heavier with time, settling into places words used to live. In some homes, the silence clung to dinner tables where someone's chair was never filled again. In others, it hung over conversations that started but never finished. The kind where a wife would pause mid-sentence, realize she was about to say his name, and then quietly change the subject. For the veterans, silence became a kind of armor, not because they had nothing to say, but because language seemed too small to carry what they'd brought home. The things they sawed, the childlike faces in foxholes, the heat of a dying man's blood through wool gloves. The instant someone stopped being a person and became memory could not be explained, only endured, and so they stopped trying. They learned to nod when thanked, to smile when called heroes, to hold back when asked about the worst of it. One man worked as a bus driver for years, never speaking of the friend who died beside him on Tumbled. Another built model ships in his garage, each one named after a vessel that didn't return. A third simply left, walking into the countryside and sending postcards with no return address. The silence they carried wasn't just absence, it was weight. It filled lungs, paused hands, echoed in the tick of clocks at night. Some families mistook it for coldness, others accepted it as a wound that couldn't be stitched. And yet, even in that silence, love found its way in through gestures, glances, rituals, a cup of tea made without asking, a porch light left on, a drawer full of letters no one read aloud. The war had taught them that some things are too big for words and too sacred to be spoken casually. But silence didn't always mean peace. For some, it was a battlefield that never stopped firing. Dreams brought back voices they tried to forget. A knock at the door startled them more than they cared to admit. And in every moment of stillness, there was the distant hum of what they'd left behind, waiting, patient, and always listening. And in that listening stillness, the dreams began returning, not always in violent flashes, but often in quiet distortions of memory, like a familiar room filled with ocean water or a child's voice echoing through battlefield fog. For some veterans, sleep was the only place the war made sense. There, their fallen friends still walked beside them, unscarred and laughing. There, the cold didn't hurt, the hunger didn't bite, and the bullets never landed. But just as often, the dreams betrayed them. They would wake gasping, heart pounding, unsure if they were in Stanley or Sheffield, in a trench or their own bed. One man kept a towel beside him at night, not for sweat, but for tears. Another refused to use pillows, convinced the softness reminded him too much of the helmets he had pressed his head against while hiding from shell fire. And yet, even the worst dreams were sometimes better than the hollow daylight. In the waking world, people asked questions they couldn't answer. They said things like, "It must have been exciting, or at least you came back," not knowing how much of them didn't. The war had taken more than lives. It had reshaped how they understood time. Moments stretched in memory, but years afterward passed in a blink. One man swore he could still smell the peat smoke from Stanley when he lit a cigarette in Manchester. Another avoided supermarkets because the overhead lights reminded him of search flares. The mind didn't let go just because the body had returned. And sometimes, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon washing dishes, tying shoelaces, waiting for a booser sound or a shadow would slide through them like cold steel. A helicopter overhead, a sudden fog, the pop of tires on gravel, and they would be back there, even if only for a second, staring into that same impossible distance, knowing again the weight of a rucksack, the tremble of fingers before a trigger, the hush before contact. The war did not ask permission to visit it, simply arrived, uninvited, through dreams, memories, or the way one's own heartbeat could mimic the rhythm of distant gunfire. It was not gone. It was only sleeping, waiting for the next breath. And in that next breath, as hearts kept rehearsing the old rhythms of war, something strange began to settle in the slow, uneasy choreography of returning to normal. But what was normal now? The world looked the same. Buses still ran, kettles still boiled, letters still came through the door. And yet, for those who had crossed that distant threshold, who had seen men vanish in fog, who had marched through gunfire, who had whispered final words over the dying, normal was no longer a destination. It was a disguise. British veterans tried to wear it, ironing uniforms for remembrance parades, smiling politely when asked about the war. But behind their eyes, something watched and waited. Some flinched when coins dropped. Others cried when bagpipes played. One man refused to use the word fireworks, calling them sky shrapnel instead. In Argentina, it was no easier. Many of the returning soldiers were ignored or ridiculed. "We lost," people muttered, as if the conscripts had chosen the defeat. A few changed careers, never mentioning their past. Others carried signs in the street, begging for recognition, pension, or simply to be believed. A boy who had buried 5 comrades at Darwin Ridge was told he should move on. He tried, he failed, he drank, but not every return was a collapse. Some found unexpected grace in small things. A child reaching for their hand, a partner who didn't ask questions, just listened. A neighbor who left bread on the doorstep without explanation. These quiet mercies stitched something back together, not the same as before, but whole in a new, strange way. Still, the heart rehearsed. Every door creaked, sounded like distant boots. Every foggy morning brought a pause. And when news came of other conflicts, new invasions, rising tensions, those same hearts clenched again, not out of patriotism or fear, but recognition. Because once you've heard war breathing, you never forget its voice. It hums in headlines. It rustles in flags. It speaks through empty chairs. And though the world might say that was long ago, the ones who survived know otherwise. Time does not erase war. It folds it into the walls, the weather, the body itself, quiet, patient, always practicing. And as time kept folding in on its self-layering past over present, war over peace, it became harder to say where memory ended and living began. Some veterans could still name every ridge, every trench, every fallen friend, as if the battlefield were more vivid than the cities they now walked through. Others forgot birthdays, addresses, even their own children's voices, but never the smell of cordite or the way cold steel felt against trembling palms. Their minds had mapped the Falklands into their very architecture, muscle and marrow, breath and bone. In Argentina, the story folded differently. For years, the government avoided commemorations, afraid to reopen the wound of a war it had lost so poorly and sold so proudly. But the soldiers remembered anyway. In bars and basements, they whispered to each other about the hunger, the frost, the fear, the betrayal. They lit candles for men buried without names. They kept medals in drawers, unsure if they meant anything at all. And in Britain, while medals were polished and parades marched on, many veterans chose not to attend. Not out of bitterness, but weariness. One said, "I already remember every day. I don't need a band to help me." And still, time kept folding. Grandchildren grew curious. What was it like? They asked, eyes wide, voices innocent. Some veterans answered gently, in metaphors and pauses. Others left the room. But a few told the truth softly, without drama, about cold hands, about sudden silence, about the strange, sacred grief that arrives when you realize the man beside you has stopped breathing, and the world around you does not stop moving. They spoke of war not as glory or failure, but as weight, one that shifted daily, one they still carried. And as the years passed, and monuments were unveiled, and documentaries aired, a quiet question floated beneath it all. Who decides how we remember? The living, the dead, the governments, or the ghosts? Because folded into the soil of those distant islands, folded into the heartbeat of those who returned, was not just a war, but a lesson. One whispered, not shouted. One still unfolding, slowly, beneath the surface of everything we choose not to say. And those lessons, still lingering beneath the surface, refused to vanish with the decades. They clung to stories half told. Glances exchanged at memorials, and the silent hesitations in interviews when the questions cut too close. For some, the lesson was that war never truly ends. It just finds new ways to breathe through the people who carry it. For others, it was that no matter how far you sail or how noble your orders may sound, a bullet is still a bullet, and a grave is still a hole in the earth with someone's name left echoing above it. On the islands themselves, the lessons were quieter, folded into the soil like sea salt and rust. Sheep grazed again where mortar had fallen. Children played where soldiers once bled. But under every footstep, the land remembered. A rusted bayonet, uncovered in a field, a shell casing in the roots of a bush, a name carved into the underside of a school desk by a boy who never came home. Islanders, too, had learned their own lessons, that independence could be a quiet defiance, that survival was not always loud, and that the line between occupation and liberation sometimes blurred at the edges. They still flew the Union Jack, but also told the stories, their own way stories, of curfews and kindness, of tension and tea shared with strangers, of fear that came without warning and left like fog. And in both Britain and Argentina, the veterans grew older. Some died without ever speaking of what happened. Others finally wrote memoirs, not to boast, but to unburden. One man published his diary under a pseudonym. Another recorded tapes for his grandchildren to hear only after his funeral. And slowly, the world made space for these softer retellings, not of strategies or victories, but of frozen fingers, of songs hummed in trenches, of the way a man's face looks when he's told his friend didn't make it. These stories didn't belong to history books, they belonged to breath, to moments, to the fragile truth that what is remembered shapes what is healed. And so the lessons, linked in bold headlines or national pride, but in silence, in soil, and in the whispered hope that next time someone might listen before the gunfire starts. And in that whispered hope, fragile but persistent, something began to take root, a sense that remembrance could be more than ritual, that perhaps the true honoring of war was not in reenactments or medals, but in the vow to listen more deeply, to pause more often, to carry the weight without passing it on as burden. In the Falklands, new generations were born who knew the war only through photographs and the nervous laughter of their elders when questions grew too sharp. They played football in the shadow of old bunkers and learned to tell landmines from driftwood. In classrooms, they heard stories of bravery and silence in equal measure. One girl, tracing her grandfather's handwriting in an old notebook, whispered to her teacher, "He was scared, wasn't he?" And the teacher, with a long breath, simply nodded. In Britain, schoolchildren wrote letters to veterans they would never meet, and in Argentina, artists painted murals of unnamed soldiers, not to glorify, but to remember. It was not a forgetting, but a soft retelling, one where the details could be gentle without being diluted, where horror wasn't erased, but held quietly, like a candle in both hands. The whisper of hope came also in how the veterans began to see one another, not as enemies, but as mirrors. At rare reunions, British and Argentine soldiers met across tables and stared at men who had once pointed weapons at them. Some cried, some embraced. Most just sat in long silence, recognizing in each other the same shadows. "We were boys," one said. "We didn't know anything." And maybe that was the deepest truth of all, that wars are never fought by those who start them, but by those still learning what it means to live. The whisper grew stronger in memorials where no flags flew, only names carved gently in stone. In radio interviews where a veteran would pause, then finally speak, in the soft hands of a nurse helping an aging soldier with his coat. In the child who asked again, why? Not to be shocked, but to understand. Hope, it seemed, was not loud. It did not march. It did not sing anthems. It sat quietly beside, grief touching its shoulder, waiting for the moment it might be heard, not above the silence, but within it. And within that silence, where hope waited, memory began to breathe again, not as a sharp flash or a sudden ache, but as a presence that lived quietly in the folds of everyday life. It was in the way a veteran tied his shoelaces each morning, with hands that still remembered the cold grip of boot leather soaked by Falklands rain. It was in the slow way he looked out the window when the clouds gathered, searching the horizon for nothing and everything. And it was in the conversations that finally started to happen, not loudly, not all at once, but in fragments over tea, on long walks, in hospice beds, when sons leaned in to hear what had never been said before. It wasn't just the bullets. One man finally told his daughter. It was the waiting, the not knowing. And then he fell quiet again, as if that single sentence had already done enough. In Argentina, some of the old conscripts began organizing community talks, where they told teenagers what it had meant to go to war without food, without boots, without a clear reason. They didn't speak of honor. They spoke of confusion, of cold, of the boy who didn't wake up beside them one morning. These small truths, offered without judgment, became bridges. Not everyone crossed them, but enough did. And so memory, like breath, began to soften. It no longer suffocated. It simply lingered like the sea mist on the island mornings, rolling in gentle and full of story. The graves on both sides of the ocean remained, and the photographs still faded on mantelpieces. But the weight of the past began to shift, just slightly, as more people were willing to carry it together. Not as a flag, not as a weapon, but as a quiet understanding of what was endured. The war did not vanish, it never could, but it no longer stood alone in shadow. It was met with care, with curiosity, with the kind of silence that listens, not hides. And in that breathing memory, there was finally space for something else to enter, not to replace grief, but to sit beside it. A kind of peace, not declared, but discovered. Not handed down, but built slowly, from one human story to the next. And in that fragile space where memory breathed and grief sat beside understanding, peace began, not by proclamation, but by listening, truly listening to what had always been buried beneath the noise. It didn't wear a uniform, and it didn't come with a parade. It arrived quietly, sometimes decades late, in the form of one man forgiving himself for surviving. In the slow healing between nations where politicians shook hands, but it was the mothers, the widows, the forgotten sons who did the real work of closing wounds. British veterans who once patrolled freezing ridges found themselves writing poetry, not about victory, but about the silence after the shelling. One man built birdhouses from old ammunition crates and smiled when wrens nested in them. "Let them make something new," he whispered. In Argentina, some former soldiers returned to the islands, not as invaders, not as ghosts, but as guests. They walked the coastline, picked up stones, and cried not for the war, but for the boy they'd been. Islanders, too, began opening their doors a little wider. "We all lost something," one woman said, serving tea to a man who had once carried a rifle down her street. That cup of tea, in its quiet steam and chipped rim, said more than speeches ever could. Across both countries, new generations came of age without the hunger to rewrite the past as glory. Instead, they asked different questions. How did it feel? What did it cost? What do we owe to those who returned and to those who didn't? Museums updated their plaques. Memorial gardens were redesigned with empty benches for sitting, not just standing. A young artist painted a mural of a British soldier and an Argentine conscript, side by side, both looking out at sea. Below them, no words, just the tide. And in that tide, peace moved slowly, not to erase, but to hold. Not to declare the past finished, but to carry its lessons forward with tenderness. Because the only peace that lasts is the one that listens. And if you leaned close enough, you could hear it in old songs, sung softer now. In boots never laced again. In stories told not to stir pride, but to soften pain. In that softness, peace was finally learning how to stay. And as peace began learning how to stay, the islands themselves, the wind-swept Falklands, once etched with trenches and scarred by shellfire, began to change too, though slowly, as if nature itself were cautious not to erase what had happened, only to soften its edges. The rusting wreckage of old equipment remained in some fields, half swallowed by grass and time, while sheep grazed unbothered between fence posts once used to string communication wire. Tourists came now, quietly, walking along trails that once marked minefields, reading small signs that said never forget, even if they did not always know what it was they were being asked to remember. Locals, many of whom had lived through the occupation, shared stories in measured tones of soldiers knocking politely, of rationed tea, of fear so thick it tasted metallic. And yet, life had returned in other forms. Children played in schoolyards, rebuilt over buried memories. Young couples married in churches that once echoed with foreign boots. A new generation of islanders born after the war but raised in its shadow learned both pride and caution. "We are strong," one girl said, during a classroom debate, "but we know how quickly the world can forget small places." That was the truth the islands held, that the quiet corners of the earth are often where history's loudest echoes settle. And so they lived with it, not frozen in trauma, but shaped by it. The land healed unevenly. Some hills still felt haunted, but others bloomed with wildflowers. A former airstrip now hosted sheepdog competitions. One man turned an old bunker into a music studio. "I like that it holds sound now," he said, instead of fear. Even the sky seemed different, less threatening, more expansive, as if the clouds had finally learned they no longer needed to hover so low. The islands were not what they had been before, but they were something still resilient, remembering, and remarkably alive. And in every gust of wind that whipped across the heather, there was a voice, faint but clear, saying, "Not just this happened, but we are still here." And beneath that wind that whispered, "We are still here," the flags once flown with trembling hands, in both defiance and desperation, began to lower, not out of surrender, but out of reverence. On both sides of the ocean, ceremonies became quieter, stripped of spectacle, leaning instead toward stillness. In Britain, Remembrance Day parades still wound their way through towns, but more veterans chose to stand at the edge rather than march. They watched, hats tucked under arms, eyes scanning the faces of boys who would never know what it meant to crawl through peat-soaked trenches or sleep with frozen socks in a crater. Some saluted, others simply nodded once and walked away. In Argentina, it took longer, but gradually, new forms of remembrance began to appear. Not just plaques of heroism, but murals of grief. Not just speeches of courage, but poems of confusion. Flags were still flown, but sometimes they were lowered deliberately at dusk, as if to say, "This memory deserves nightfall." And in the hearts of those who had once clutched those flags like lifelines, whether atop Mount, tumbled down, or outside a bombed-out mess, whole the act of lowering them became sacred. Not defeat, not erasure, just a gesture of rest. Because flags, like memories, were never meant to be permanent declarations. They were meant to rise when needed and fall when the time was right. In some homes, small personal flags remained folded in drawers, wrapped in the last letters of a brother, a son, a husband. One woman touched hers each year on the anniversary, then carefully returned it to its place between linen and silence. Another flew his flag only once a year, alone in a coastal village where he'd lived since the war. "Just so the wind remembers," he told a neighbor, and the wind did. It carried those colors not with pride or shame, but with tenderness, because it had seen everything. The march, the retreat, the long wait, the burial, the homecoming, and now the peace. So when the flags lowered, the sky did not protest. It opened, it received. And somewhere in the background, across the Atlantic or the islands or the pages of memory, a quiet voice echoed. Not every banner must wave forever. Some must simply rest. And in the gentle hush that followed the lowering of flags, rest began to arrive, not loudly, not suddenly, but like dusk slipping into the corners of a familiar room. It came to the aging soldiers first, those whose backs had long carried the invisible weight of frostbitten nights, of silent screams, of friends who vanished into smoke. Some of them, now in care homes or tucked into quiet apartments, found their final years strangely peaceful. The world no longer asked them for answers. They were allowed, at last, to simply be. One British veteran who had once buried a friend beneath a cairn of frozen rocks now kept birds and named them after lost comrades. An Argentine conscript who hadn't spoken of the war in 30 years finally told his grandson a single story, just one, but he told it with his hands trembling and his eyes steady. In those small offerings, rest entered like a soft tide. It also came to the land. Fields once torn open by trench shovels softened under spring rains. The old battle sites were no longer avoided, but walked gently by islanders, by tourists, by those searching not for answers, but for presence. One young man knelt beside a rusted helmet and whispered, "Thank you," though he didn't know to whom. Maybe that didn't matter. Rest isn't about names, it's about the stillness that follows when names no longer need to be spoken to be felt. And rest also settled into the silence between generations. The young no longer asked, "Who won?" but instead, "What did we learn?" The elders, when they answered, often paused, not out of hesitation, but care, because rest is slow. It requires space. And for the first time since that Cold War in 1982, there was enough space to breathe without guilt, to remember without breaking, to feel without fear. The war hadn't vanished. Its scars still existed in memory, in stone, in muscle, but they no longer dictated every heartbeat. They pulsed gently now, like old hymns half remembered, and into that rhythm, rest entered fully, wrapping the past not in erasure, but in understanding. The kind of understanding that lets the body sleep deeply, knowing it no longer needs to stand watch. And as rest settled fully into the bones of memory, it became clear that something else remained, something quieter but enduring. Like the way breath lingers in the cold long after the voice has fallen silent, the stories stayed. Not all of them, some vanished with those who chose never to speak. Some were lost to time, buried in letters never sent, in glances never explained. But others found new roots, spoken softly over tea, scribbled in the margins of diaries, shared in classrooms, and whispered in museums where names no longer needed battles to prove their worth. These stories were not about heroes or villains. They were about boys who grew old too soon, about wind that screamed across dark hills, about hands held in the dark, and words choked on salt and sorrow. They were about waiting, always waiting for dawn, for orders, for something to come that might never arrive. And yet, within those stories was something deeper than war, humanity, the same trembling fear in an Argentine trench as in a British foxhole, the same prayer muttered in two languages, toward the same unknowable sky, the same dream of home, a mother's face, a sibling's laughter, the smell of bread, the sound of a kettle boiling far away. In the end, these stories did not belong to one flag or one country. They belonged to time, to earth, to the long breath of history that asks not who fired first, but who remembers last. Some were etched into stone, others into skin. One man had the coordinates of the battlefield tattooed on his arm, not as a claim, but as a reminder. This is where I was remade, and across the ocean, a woman kept a journal of every dream her brother described before he disappeared into the mist. He comes back in dreams now, she once said, always whole. These stories stayed not to reopen wounds, but to keep them from disappearing, because forgetting is a second death. And in keeping memory alive not with pain, but with care, the world is quietly changed, not by the loud retellings of history, but by the gentle ones, the ones told like lullabies, the ones folded into letters and passed down like prayers, the ones that whisper, "We endured, we remembered, and now we rest." And now, as the final story settles into stillness, there is only quiet that holds everything. The gunfire has long faded, the boots have stopped marching, but the breath of those who remember still moves gently through the world, like fog across a field, like the hush before sleep. We don't tell these stories to glorify war. We tell them to hold hands with its memory, to say, "You mattered, you were here, and we heard you." Whether in the rustle of old letters, the clink of medals tucked in drawers, or the silence shared across generations, these echoes remain not to haunt, but to guide. We listened not just to facts, but to feeling, not just to history, but to humanity. And so, as you rest now perhaps with your eyes closing, or your heart a little heavier, we invite you to carry this softness forward. Let memory be gentle, let truth be quiet and whole. Subscribe to our channel so we can meet again next time with more stories the world forgot to tell softly. Other stories are also waiting for you, patient and still, just like this one, because sometimes history only speaks when the world is ready to listen.